Just how big will The Winds of Winter be when George R. R. Martin finally finishes writing it? He has said that it will be huge, but what does that mean? 1,000 pages? 2,000? More? Let's work it out based on what we already know. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we cover A Song of Ice and Fire in nerdy detail, as well as The Lord of the Rings, The Witcher, and much more. Welcome. This is a slightly different style of video this week, and yes, it's an updated version of a previous video I did on this topic, but this question of exactly how big The Winds of Winter will be is something that I'm asked a lot, so I thought I'd try and work it out. And yes, please do feel free to post your skepticism and the like in the comments section. Believe me, I hear you. But on this channel, I remain positive and optimistic and supportive of George. And since I last did a video on this, we've had a few updates from the great man. He suggested a couple of times back in 2022 that he was about 3/4 of the way through and 1,100 or 1,200 manuscript pages in. So that puts his estimation at about 1,600 pages when it's all done. Manuscript pages, that is, which aren't the same as what we might get in a book. He has written more since then, and as a Gardner writer, things may well have changed, but let's see what we think. I wouldn't be human if I didn't get some satisfaction from that being almost exactly my estimation too in my original video a couple of years earlier, back in 2020, but things might have changed. I'll keep the same basic approach though. We'll work through all the different plot lines that have to happen or probably will happen in the next book and add it all up. So this will also count as an overview of roughly what I think will happen in The Winds of Winter. We'll map out how many chapters we need for each of the POV characters to tell the story that seems to need telling, then add them up. Easy. Well, not easy, obviously. So before we get into the detail, here are a few quick starting points. Firstly, we do have a lot to go on in working out the early plot of The Winds of Winter, not least what happens next after the action in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, and the 11 pre-released chapters we've seen or heard so far. There will be repercussions from Varys killing Kevan Lannister in King's Landing, for example, and we do need to see what happens after Jon Snow's assassination. We have the show, of course, although we won't lean too heavily on that in this video, just as a sort of outline of the direction of events rather than the detail, by which I mean that Daenerys will make it across to Westeros, Jon will come back from the dead, the others will keep heading south, and so on. Those broad brush events fit the book narrative too. And we do have more than a few snippets of information from George R. R. Martin himself over the years. For example, he has confirmed that there will be 2 battles near the start of the book, at Meereen and outside Winterfell, that the fandom have dubbed the Battles of Fire and of Ice. And we've had a clear steer from George that there will be a prologue, and that we won't get any new POV characters. And crucially for this video, that he has been working at various stages with various different POV characters that he's named, so we know that they will get chapters. So we have a lot to go on, but this is still very much a matter of educated guesswork. This is George R. R. Martin's story, and he could go wherever he wants with it. I'm confident that a lot of what I'm going to predict here will be right, but I'm equally confident that a lot will be wrong. We can be sure of some of the early action, but in the second half of the book, well, anything is possible. Regardless, this is my best guess at the moment. And giving credit where it's due, I'm not the first to try this. I have seen an excellent video taking a mathematical approach to the conundrum of how to fit the story into one volume. However, I'm trying something different here. I want to work out, based on the likely plot, the various nuggets of information George R. R. Martin has given us, and so on, what the most likely number of chapters is that he needs to tell the story he seems to want to tell. Let's try to put a guesstimate number on how big this story needs to be, rather than decide what restrictions need to happen to the storytelling in order to fit it into a certain number of volumes. We can worry about what that means for the likely publication schedule later. Okay, enough caveats. Let's start trying to work out just how big this book is going to be. And it will be big. George R. R. Martin has already admitted that it will be, in his words, huge, and almost certainly the largest of the series so far. It's easy to see why. We're at the largest point of the narrative, when the characters are spread across the most different locations. So in order for us to see what's happening in each of these locations, he needs different POV characters. A reasonable assumption, therefore, is that this book will, at a very high level, be about bringing all of these disparate characters and groups back into Westeros and some of them back together. I think it's a fair assumption that the story in this book will take us up to roughly when Daenerys arrives in Westeros, or perhaps Dragonstone, with her invasion fleet and dragons, and the others will reach the Wall in the north. Ice and fire at opposite ends of the continent makes for a nice symbolic ending to the book, and sets things up nicely for the final book, A Dream of Spring. So that's the frame we are working to. And it allows probably over a year of in-universe time, given how long it must take Daenerys to get from wherever she is in the Dothraki Sea to presumably Vaes Dothrak, do things there, then again presumably go back to Meereen, deal with everything she needs to do there, plus probably deal with at least Volantis on a long sea journey up to Dragonstone. A lot can happen in that time. And as a technical point, the storylines in A Feast for Crows, the Ironborn, Brienne, Dawn and so on, finished a few months before the storylines in A Dance with Dragons did. So we'll probably get more from those plot lines in the first few chapters of the book as they catch up to the Dance with Dragons storylines. So let's break the story down into its constituent parts, then work through broadly what has to happen, and then, based on George R. R. Martin's writing style and which POV characters are there, roughly how many chapters that means for each POV character. The first block of story we'll tackle is Daenerys getting from where she is, amassing an army and navy, and heading over to Westeros, no doubt picking up people like Tyrion along the way. The second is the interconnected series of events happening in the south of Westeros. Young Griff, Aegon VI's invasion, Cersei and the Tyrells in King's Landing, how Dawn reacts to events, what Euron is up to, and how that will impact on Sam and co in the Citadel. The third block is in the Riverlands, Jaime, Brienne, Lady Stoneheart and so on. The fourth is the north, at the Wall with Jon and Melisandre, near Winterfell with Stannis and Theon, the threat of the others, and at least one battle with the Boltons. Then we get the Starks, who are dotted about all over the place, but probably all ending up at Winterfell or in the north. Sansa starting in the Vale, Arya in Braavos, Bran north of the Wall, and Rickon on Skagos, who we will probably pick up through Davos's point of view chapters. Then, finally, we have the inevitable few odds and ends of stories and characters, a prologue and possibly an epilogue, possibly a few other random new characters, and so on. A big task, but I think we're up to it, so hold on tight. So let's start with the block of story around Daenerys. We last saw her in the Dothraki Sea, about to be captured by the Dothraki. So to bring her back to Meereen, where her story will merge with all the people there, she will need to be transported to Vaes Dothrak. That's probably a chapter on its own. Then, in line with her vision in the House of the Undying, she will be taken to the Dosh Khaleen, burn down the Khals, and claim her title as Khal of the whole Dothraki nation. Yes, that could all happen in one chapter, but that would be a bit rushed, so maybe another 2 and 1 more to get her heading back to Meereen and organise her new Blood Riders. So let's call this 4 chapters to get Dany through her Dothraki storyline and back to Meereen. Meanwhile, in Meereen, there's a lot still going on. There's the Harpies' rebellion, the identity of the Harpy him or herself, and most immediately the siege of Meereen by the Yunkish. That's the so-called Battle of Fire. We've already had a couple of chapters in A Dance with Dragons of Barristan Selmy ruling in Dany's stead, and 2 pre-released chapters from the Winds of Winter with Barristan riding out to war against the besieging Yunkish army. I said in my video about that I suspect George R. R. Martin may end up merging those 2 chapters, but surely we'll have another Barristan chapter as he wraps up the battle. In the build-up to that battle, we have also had a Victarion chapter, in which he comes up with a plan to have Dragonbinder blown, so surely we will see that happen in the battle or soon after. So 2 Barristan chapters and 2 Victarion chapters leading up to the end of the siege. We've also had 2 pre-released Tyrion chapters, in which he is persuading the Second Sons to switch sides as the battle starts up. They do, and we last see Tyrion about to join the fray, though again I wonder whether those 2 chapters might be merged. Then afterwards there will inevitably be some sorting out of the mess, because Dany still won't be back. Tyrion and Jorah will need to see Barristan. Jorah had been banished, and Tyrion is an important political figure, given his nephew is currently King of the Seven Kingdoms. There will also be the aftermath of Victarion trying to capture those dragons, and no doubt the Harpies will still be trying to stir up discontent. And on top of all of that, there is another fleet heading its way to Meereen, Volantis. That will surely be the 3rd siege of Meereen. It makes sense for Dany to arrive back during that battle, as she arrived during a battle during the show, and we'll have to see what happens there as well. So let's call this conservatively another 3 or 4 chapters spread across Tyrion and Ser Barristan, of them dealing with the aftermath of one siege, internal wranglings and introductions, and probably then a third siege. So, to add all that up, to get Daenerys back to Meereen and all her immediate foes vanquished will be, say, 14 chapters. That may sound a lot, but George R.R. Martin has released 5 of these already in various forms, and none of them were Daenerys chapters, and we will surely see her with the Dothraki, so this seems about right. Then what? Well, broadly speaking, Dany has to sort out the situation in Meereen, deal with any other enemies she may have. Karth also seems to have declared war, don't forget. Agree on the fates of the many people coming to meet her. As well as Victarion, Tyrion and Jorah, there's also Moqorro and Marwyn, various sellsword companies and so on, and sail to Westeros. I also suspect that Dany probably has some business in Volantis and maybe Pentos as well. Trying to count chapters at this point becomes quite a fool's mission, because George R.R. Martin could make this section as long or as short as he wants, and with 4 POV characters in the same place he could show events from many different perspectives. So let's try to work out how much more plot they each have and how much George likes to use them, and go from there. Victarion, I suspect, hasn't much life left. Not just my view. George has described him as being thick as a stump, and his confidence is surely hubris. Once Daenerys discovers that he tried to steal her dragons, his life will be forfeit. Daenerys needs his ships, but not him. After the chapters we've already discussed, I give Victarion maybe just 1 more. Ser Barristan's purpose as a POV character will also be diminished. He was only really introduced in A Dance with Dragons because we needed to be able to see what was happening in Meereen while Dany was gone. He has a wealth of information about the backstory of Rhaegar, Robert's Rebellion and all that, but he always seemed to get interrupted before saying anything really useful. With Dany and Tyrion arriving, his role as our eyes in Meereen will have gone, so perhaps he'll die in the city, or perhaps he will soldier on, but with fewer POV chapters. His thoughts about the person claiming to be Aegon VI would certainly be interesting, and Tyrion will surely tell him about that, but Barristan isn't a central character anymore, so perhaps just 1 or 2 more chapters after the ones we've already talked about. But for what it's worth, I'd love to see a chapter from his perspective when Tyrion talks about his experiences with young Griff. The majority of the rest of the chapters will therefore be Daenerys and Tyrion. Both have obviously been pretty significant characters so far, and there's no reason to think that that will change. Tyrion has between 9 and 15 chapters every book he's been in, and Dany between 5 and 10. My guess is that we will see some of this from her perspective, definitely her decisions on what to do with Moqorro and the Red Priests, Marwyn and Victarion, but a lot of it from Tyrion's. We do always get a lot of chapters from Tyrion's perspective, even when there are other POV characters around, and George R.R. Martin often uses his insight to help us as readers understand what is really going on, figuring out who young Griff was, for example, or unpicking the politics in King's Landing. Perhaps he will be the one to figure out who the Harpy is, and gain Dany's trust that way. Given how much George likes to use him, I'll say he gets 5 more. To get Daenerys up to her average from previous books needs another 2 or 3. Let's say 3, as it's hard to imagine her having fewer than that with all that plot to get through. Pulling all of that together, we have about 7 Daenerys chapters, 9 Tyrion, 2 of which we've already seen, 5 for Ser Barristan, again 2 of which we've already seen, and 3 for Victarion, 1 of which we've already seen, making a grand total of 24 chapters to get Team Daenerys across to Westeros. When Daenerys arrives in Westeros, she will likely not be able to just land at King's Landing and proclaim herself queen. Cersei, Tommen and the Lannisters are there at the end of Book 5, supported by the Tyrells, but Aegon VI is mid-invasion. Euron is playing his own game off the south coast of Westeros, and Doran Martell is still engaged in his endless political plots. Lest we forget, Sam is also newly arrived at the Citadel, intersecting with an apparent Faceless Men plotline. Starting at King's Landing, the last chapter of A Dance with Dragons was Varys sowing seeds of discontent between the Lannisters and the Tyrells by murdering Kevan Lannister and Pycelle and framing the Tyrells. Cersei will surely want to get vengeance on the Tyrells, and there is also obviously the issue of her impending trial before the High Sparrow and Marjorie's. On the show, of course, she dealt with all of those problems in one by blowing up the Great Sept. If I had to bet, she'll probably do something similar in the books. She's the only POV character we have in King's Landing at the moment, but she acts quickly. So let's say 2 chapters for rounding off the Tyrell, Faith Militant and Tommen and Margaery storylines. Next up will be young Griff's inevitable attack on King's Landing. This seems to primarily be being shown from Jon Connington's perspective. We had 2 POV chapters from him at the end of the last book. We hear in an Arianne chapter that his army has apparently taken Storm's End, so perhaps we will see that rather than just hear about it, and I imagine that a reasonable amount of time will be taken up by Team Fagon trying to build a coalition. They sent off letters to various people when launching the invasion, so we will need to see what comes back from that. Let's say 2 Jon Connington chapters, one for taking Storm's End, one for coalition building and marching on King's Landing. Probably the most significant of these alliances will be with Dorne. Doran Martell has sent Arianne to find Fagon. We've had 2 pre-released chapters from her already on that mission, so surely we will see at least a third where she meets him and reports back to her father. It's probably an underestimation, but let's say 3 Arianne chapters, including the 2 we already have. Doran will then need to decide what to do, and he will probably also receive back the bones of his son Quentyn at some point here, and at some stage have to deal with Gerald Dane. George R. R. Martin has confirmed that there will be at least one Areo Hotah chapter in The Winds of Winter, Areo being Doran's bodyguard, so that's probably how we will see what's going on there. Areo has had just 1 chapter in each of the last 2 books, and as Doran won't be the centre of the action, let's give Areo 1 chapter again this time. So that's 8 chapters leading up to the attack on King's Landing. Then there will be the attack. We don't know how much detail George R. R. Martin will go into here, or even how strongly King's Landing will be defended. If Cersei drives out the Tyrells and Fagon arrives with a large enough army, someone like Qyburn would surely recommend she beat a hasty retreat. But we will have at least 2 or perhaps 3 POV characters there, Cersei, Jon Connington, and maybe Arianne. Maybe this will be a full battle spanning several chapters, or maybe it will be swiftly over with Cersei escaping. I think the latter is more likely. So let's estimate 2 chapters, at the end of which Fagon will probably be installed in King's Landing and Cersei on her way to Casterly Rock. We were told we would see Casterly Rock at some point, and this seems the most likely time. Anyway, to round off young Griff's timeline in the book, we will probably have a few more chapters. It won't just end with him claiming King's Landing. He will want to solidify his rule, choose a Kingsguard, a small council, repair any damage to the city, and so on. Varys will be plotting, Jon Connington's grayscale is probably going to get worse, and there may even be a marriage between Fagon and Arianne. Doran Martell's default clever plan in life seems to be to try to marry his family to the Targaryens, and Arianne is ambitious, so don't rule it out. Dany's vision in the House of the Undying suggested that young Griff would be popular, so we'll probably need to see him do things the locals like. And then to round it all off, there will surely be some preparations for Daenerys' arrival and decisions on what to do with Dragonstone and so on. There's a lot here, probably spread across Jon Connington and Arianne chapters. I don't know how long George R. R. Martin will want to focus on this, but let's give it 2 chapters to round off this part of the story. So that's 4 chapters in total for the attack on King's Landing and young Griff's storyline up to the end of the book. The other person doing things in the south is, of course, Euron. He isn't a POV character. It would be scary to see inside that mind, to be sure. Instead, we'll see what he's doing through the perspective of Aeron Greyjoy. We've had 1 pre-released chapter of that already. It's filled with apocalyptic visions and preparations for a massive sea battle. Presumably, we will see the same sea battle from Aeron's perspective, so let's say there's a chapter for that too. I suspect that Aeron will actually survive that battle, if only because he's the only character allowing us to see what Euron is up to. Then we have all the hints that Euron will launch an attack on Oldtown. George R. R. Martin does seem to be trying to keep Euron quite distant, so we never know exactly what he's up to, but let's give him, say, 1 more chapter to wrap up the aftermath of whatever insane eldritch magic he has been casting, so 3 Aeron chapters covering the period up to the attack on Oldtown. Before we get to that attack, though, we will surely get some chapters from Sam's perspective. He only just arrived there at the end of the last book, so he will presumably join up at the Citadel, start studying, discover some things, and all the while in the background there will be the Faceless Men plotline and a lot of fascinating characters. He will also need to drop off Gilly at the family home, which will surely be worth a chapter on its own. So let's give Sam 3 or 4 chapters to do at least some of what he traversed the entire continent to do. I'd like to see more here, but time may not be on his side. Then there will be the attack on Oldtown that we've had so much foreshadowing of. Let's say we see that from both Sam and Aaron's perspective. Oldtown is massive and worthy of more than just a passing description of its destruction, and I'm sure we will see a mad scramble to save books and knowledge and lives by Sam and others. 2 chapters, say. Sam will probably then head back north. Maybe we'll have another chapter of him stopping off at his family home up the road to pick up Gilly and maybe Heartsbane. So that's 9 chapters, covering Euron's story up to Oldtown, Sam in the Citadel. The 5 chapters I'm suggesting he has in this book are about the same amount he had in the other 2 books that he's been a POV character in, so that sounds about right, and all the other subplots in Oldtown. That leaves Euron and Cersei with storylines to finish off. This will be a long way into the book, so things are a lot less clear, but personally I suspect that Euron will realise that Daenerys is not going to be his bride and turn his attentions to Cersei, who will be looking for allies after she had to flee King's Landing and Jaime never responded to her plea for help. Obviously on the TV show, those 2 got together and plotted bad things, so perhaps they will in the books too. I suspect that the Winds of Winter will take their story up to roughly that point, leaving a Dream of Spring to chart what they actually do while ice and fire envelop the land. Aeron may well have served his purpose for Euron by that point, so we may just see it from Cersei's perspective. Let's give her 3 chapters to get to Casterly Rock, lick her wounds there, plot with Qyburn, and meet Euron. All of which gives us a grand total of 24 chapters for the entire Southern Westeros storyline. Young Griff, Cersei, Euron, Dorne, the Tyrells, the lot of them. The various intersecting plotlines in the Riverlands are probably the hardest to predict in the Winds of Winter, if only because of the massive characters and competing agendas. We have 2 POV characters there, Jaime and Brienne, and lots of other characters and groups just missing, hidden, or roaming around there. Lady Stoneheart, the Brotherhood Without Banners, the Hound, the Blackfish, Jane Westerling, Robb's widow, and so on. George R. R. Martin could conceivably have any of these groups or people bump into each other in any order, so detailed plotline here is tough. However, we do have a few clues. We last saw Jaime and Brienne heading off towards Lady Stoneheart, so we will surely see that interaction. There will also surely then be some kind of trial, fair or otherwise, for Jaime's crimes against the Starks. Jaime will survive, hopefully, and not hate Brienne for her duplicity, hopefully, so maybe he will head off on some mission to prove his good intentions. With Arya still in Braavos and Lady Stoneheart set on revenge against the Freys, it wouldn't surprise me if she, not Arya, is responsible for the kind of massacre at the Twins we saw on the show, maybe at the forthcoming wedding at Riverrun. I think the endpoint here for the Riverlands in the Winds of Winter is for the Lannisters to no longer be in control of the Riverlands. Jaime and Brienne heading north, or about to head north and getting closer to each other. The Hound back in the story, Tully's back where they belong, and Lady Stoneheart perhaps starting to get to understand that not all of her children are dead. How many chapters might that take? Your educated guess is as good as mine here, but Brienne had 8 chapters in A Feast for Crows, and Jaime had the same across that and A Dance with Dragons. So given that they will be together for a bit of the time, and George R. R. Martin tends not to give us the exact same action from 2 perspectives, let's give them, and the Riverlands as a whole, 10 chapters. That seems reasonable given that this is a complicated area of plot, but not as central to the whole storyline as what is happening in the north, or around King's Landing, or with Daenerys. There is a lot of plot going on in the north, and a lot of different POV characters that we might see the action through. Theon, Asher, Jon, Melisandre, Davos, and presumably later we may get Bran, Sansa and Arya returning as well. Let's start by focusing first on those first 4 characters and the main storylines in the north before the rest of the Starks return there. There is a battle brewing in a crofters' village not too far from Winterfell. The Manderleys and Freys are riding off to attack Stannis' forces. I won't go into the specifics of this battle, other than to say that George R. R. Martin has specifically mentioned that it will be happening, and that it will probably mark the start of the revelation of the Great Northern Conspiracy. There is no way the Manderleys are going to fight alongside the Freys. They are stark loyalists. We have 2 POV characters in Stannis' camp at the moment, Theon and Asher, so we will probably see all this from their perspective, although wouldn't it be great to finally see some of this from Stannis' perspective? A guy can dream. We have 1 pre-released chapter from Theon already, which set up a trip to the Weirwood Tree on the island in a nearby frozen lake, so that's probably another chapter before the battle, or maybe even as the battle starts. Then at least 1 chapter to cover the battle itself, and another to cover the aftermath. probably split between Asher and Theon. That's 4 chapters, including the one we already have, to deal with Theon's current predicament, defeating the Frey army and setting up an assault on Winterfell itself, because the Boltons will have mostly stayed inside Winterfell's reassuring walls during that whole scuffle. Roose Bolton, who is alive and well in the books, is no fool. Now let's go back up to the Wall, where Jon has been killed. I've seen it suggested a few times that Jon might not have any POV chapters from now on, like Cat hasn't as Lady Stoneheart. That is definitely possible, but we will still need to see the action up there, and the only other POV character we have there at the moment is Melisandre. Does George really want to have that much of the story from inside her head? We'll see. I'm sure we'll get at least 1 or 2 more from her, though. Whoever's eyes we see it through, there is a lot to work through. We'll need to see the fallout from the assassination. What will happen to those involved? There's the whole Shireen situation, which I suspect will come to a fiery conclusion in this book. Jon's presumed return, decisions on what to do about Winterfell and Hardhome, Justin Massey and Fake Arya and Tycho Nestoris will all arrive. There's the baby swap plotline to unravel. There's surely at least 4 chapters worth here, all told, before Jon is back in charge and able to make some decisions, assuming we think that's the way the story goes. Then we'll need to actually retake Winterfell. This will probably be a combination of Stannis' forces, Jon and the Wildlings heading down the Wall, whatever forces are lying in wait as a part of the Great Northern Alliance, and perhaps, as on the show, the Knights of the Vale showing up to help with Sansa and Littlefinger. We'll get onto them in a moment. We could conceivably see this from any one of 4 or 5 different perspectives, but surely the reclamation of Winterfell will take at least 3 chapters for full dramatic effect. And there will be loose ends. What about the Dreadfort? I could see someone like Asher being tasked with taking that, perhaps giving her a chapter or 2, and the will that legitimizes Jon, and maybe even the Northern Lords declaring him the King of Winter. That will need to play out. And the reunion of returning Starks, as we'll get onto in a moment. I suspect that the major R plus L equals J plotline may wait until the next book, but even so, I would say that Winterfell after the battle will need maybe 3 more chapters at least, adding in another couple of chapters for the continuation of Theon's redemption arc, and perhaps a couple more for Melisandre to face the implications of what happens with Stannis and what she did to Shireen. That leaves us with a grand total of, let's say, 20 chapters. It's a lot, but there's a lot of plot to get through. What about Bran? Well, George R. R. Martin has actually been using Bran chapters quite sparingly since he headed north. Just 4 chapters in A Storm of Swords and 3 in A Dance with Dragons. He is seemingly giving him time to train up as a tree wizard. Nevertheless, I think we will see him in the Winds of Winter. I suspect there will be at least 1 of him training and learning new powers and knowledge. We've been teased that we will see even further north in this book, and the most likely way for that to happen is via Bran's powers. Then we know that there will be the hold the door moment. Not in exactly the same way as on the show, but similar enough. Then Bran and Meera will head back down south to the Wall in Winterfell. Bran should arrive in Winterfell in time for when the others approach the Wall, maybe. I think George R. R. Martin is deliberately not giving us too many Bran POV chapters because he will increasingly become incredibly powerful and knowledgeable, and he will want to hold back some bits of information from the reader for dramatic purposes. But we will need to see what happens with him in this book, so let's go with there being 4 Bran chapters. 1 for learning about the others and more, 1 for the escape and hold the door, 1 travelling south, and 1 arriving at Winterfell. Arya is, as we know, one of George R. R. Martin's favourite characters, so we will definitely see more from her. She will start off the Winds of Winter in Braavos, training to be a faceless man. In fact, we already have 1 pre-release chapter for her called Mercy. In that, she is continuing her training, but can't help herself from killing someone on her list when she can. I think we can expect her overall story in this book to be about that conflict between being a Stark and becoming no one, and will end with her coming back to Westeros to finish off her kill list and reunite with the Starks. She'll probably head to Winterfell when she learns that Jon is back there as Lord. She always was closest to Jon. George R. R. Martin has used her sparingly in the last couple of books as she trains, just 3 and 2 chapters respectively, after 10 and 13 in the books when she was wandering around the Riverlands. This book will probably be a bit of both, training and travelling. So let's say we will get the 1 chapter we already have, plus another couple where she trains a bit more, then decides or is forced to leave. A chapter of her travelling to Westeros and deciding to head north, and another where she arrives. If she encounters anyone on the way, it could be more, but let's say 6 chapters to finish off Arya's story in Braavos and get her back to Westeros. That's roughly halfway between what we got with the Arya light recent books and the Arya heavy early books. Sansa's story at the moment is another relatively self-contained one. She's the only POV character we have in the Vale, so her whole storyline will be seen through her eyes. George R. Martin has also been using her rather sparingly since she got to the Vale, just 3 chapters in the last 2 books, but if she's to get to Winterfell, as I suspect she will, then we will need to get through quite a bit of plot. Littlefinger is setting her up with a character called Harry Harding, who, while not appearing to be Ramsay-like, probably won't turn out to be the love of her life. That will need to all be dealt with, along with a tourney to decide on the new Brotherhood of Winged Knights. We'll surely see that. Plus Littlefinger's machinations in the Vale. He has a grain storage scam going on, and a lot of the Vale Lords are set against him at the moment. And then I suspect he will bring Sansa up to Winterfell, sniffing out an opportunity for Sansa to take control, if it looks for a moment like she might be the surviving Stark with the greatest claim. Remember, at the start of this book, he and almost everyone else thinks that Bran and Rickon are dead. Robb is also dead, and Arya missing. So we have 1 chapter already from her perspective, plus another couple for the tourney and Harry Harding, and maybe a couple more where Littlefinger's plans are starting to work out and they head north. Let's call it 5. More than she got in the last couple of books, but less than in the first 3. It may be more, but it certainly won't be less than that in my view. What about Rickon? He's not a POV character, but Davos is, and we last saw Davos about to head off to try to find Rickon on Skagos. I think he'll succeed and bring Rickon back, but only for Rickon to die. All the foreshadowing seems to point that way. So let's give Davos 1 chapter arriving at Skagos, finding him and Osha and persuading them to come with him, another when they get back to White Harbour, and 1 more when they arrive up at Winterfell. Of course, George R. R. Martin could omit all this and just have them show up unannounced, as happened on the show, but given the amount of chapters Davos has already had fruitlessly trudging and sailing through the north, exploring White Harbour and rotting in the Wolf's Den, it seems a bit unlikely that he'd stop showing us what he's up to now. Maybe he'll keep it to a trim 2 chapters and show Davos and Rickon arriving from someone else's POV. Because when Davos gets back up to Winterfell, he will be back among the other characters with significant POVs. Jon, Theon, maybe Asher and Melisandre and so on. So the need for his perspective will be diminished somewhat. So maybe just 1 more chapter after that. Perhaps with him finding out about Shireen. He's a great character, but Davos, like Sir Barristan, is mostly used when there are no other POV characters around. The 3 chapters we've given him here is around his average from the other 3 books he's appeared in, so that seems about right for him. And finally, we know there will be a prologue featuring Jane Westerling. Perhaps there will be an epilogue too. He's done that in 2 of 5 books so far, but let's assume not. So what does all that add up to? 97 chapters. At his average word count of exactly 5,145 words per chapter, yes, I checked, although that has been increasing as the story has progressed. That would be just under 500,000 words in total, roughly. And just to emphasise again what I said earlier, this is just an estimation. Both the chapter counts per character and the word total. I don't expect to be right on any of the details here. It's the overall picture that we're looking at. So, how big is that? Well, the biggest books so far in the series are A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons, weighing in at 82 and 73 chapters respectively, and both at about 415,000 words. This would then be about 20-25% bigger than that, which may sound like an overestimate on my part, but there's a lot of plot to get through, and George has said that it will almost certainly be bigger than A Storm of Swords. And even though he is writing it slowly, it's still, at the time of recording this video, 14 years of writing going into it. What does that mean in terms of a page count? Well, that obviously depends on font size, page size, edition, whether you're talking about manuscript or published pages, etc. But according to Wikipedia, at least, A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons US first edition hardbacks came in at 973 and 1,016 pages respectively, so we might expect this to be 1,200 pages or something a bit more. Incidentally, the last time George gave us anything like an estimate, a few years ago, he said he was 1,200 manuscript pages in and perhaps 75% done, so he was on track for 1,600. But manuscript pages are notoriously not the same as final published pages, so take that with a pinch of salt. What's perhaps even more interesting is what this means for publication, because 1,200 or more pages is a lot for one book. George R. R. Martin will almost certainly come under pressure from his publishers to break it down into 2 or maybe even 3 books for very practical reasons of size, as well as the obvious financial benefits. And when you remember that many editions so far have come with perhaps 100 extra pages of appendices, maps, acknowledgements, and so on, I simply can't see how this could be published as one book. Of course, A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons were both published in many countries in 2 volumes. But what do you think? I've made a lot of assumptions in this video about what plot needs to be covered in this book, and although I concluded this would be easily the biggest book in the series, I haven't taken account of any potential new characters or plot lines our favourite Gardner writer might want to include that we simply don't know about. Do you think it could be even longer than I estimated, or have I overestimated? I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. If you'd like to see more A Song of Ice and Fire videos like this, there's a link to my playlist on the left of your screen now. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.